I'm new to the city. It's going to be a year in September, and I was lucky enough to start working with a very well-known editor, Tim Redmond. So I'm reporting for 48 Hills. Um, so just a bit of background of working as a freelance journalist. I've worked as a freelance journalist in Pakistan. That's where I'm from. I've done some freelance work in Hong Kong, briefly, and also now in San Francisco. So, as a freelance journalist, having worked for mainstream media and also for independent media, I know for a fact that as freelancers, you have to work at least 5 times as hard as staffers, especially if you're going to work or if you're going to pitch pieces to publications that are well known or well established. And part of the reason why is because a lot of the pitching that you're going to be doing to media platforms is difficult because they need to know why they should give some job to a freelancer when they can get their own staffer to do the same job. And for that, I felt that as freelancers, you have to find the niche. You have to find what is it that you can do, what is it that you can offer in your stories, what is it in your work that you can offer that sets you apart from other reporters. So I chose to be a freelancer for as long as I have because I wanted to maintain my independence, to be able to report the stories that I wanted to report, and to be able to write on things that I do want to. Not saying that people who work full time don't have that independence, but freelancers have more of that independence than most. So I was asked briefly to speak about some advice that I would have to freelancers or people who are thinking of freelancing. Some of the struggles that are faced by freelancers, including myself, and I'll touch briefly on what Steve said as well, is that as a freelancer, you will not be paid as much as a staffer because you're paid per story. That means that you may not be able to afford the kind of health insurance or insurance that somebody will get if they're full-time. That brings me to the fact that 2 months ago, nearly 2 months ago, I was covering a protest for 48 Hills at City Hall. This was at the end of a 17-day hunger strike that happened just across the street here. And I was there since 1 p.m. A few young protesters had decided to occupy City Hall. They had made their intentions very clear that they were going to stay there. And I had identified myself to the sheriffs multiple times because we were, as reporters, going back and forth, asking them what they were planning to do, and so on and so forth. At some time around 9 p.m., the sheriffs decided that they were going to start pushing and shoving people against desks and pillars and basically just shove them with their batons all the way to the doors. And that was their way of dispersing people. I've been here very briefly, but I've been part of enough protests and I've covered enough protests to know that this has not happened before. This is not normal procedure. Usually they call for dispersal goes out multiple times, and the protesters who do not disperse are then arrested, and they intend to get arrested. Whether it's evictions, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's any protest, that's normal. And I was filming, and thank God I was filming at that time. So I had my camera on and I was filming as the protesters were being arrested, and I was standing against the security desk at City Hall. Everything had dismantled. And at this point, 4 sheriffs came in and started pushing a couple of protesters and me against the desk. I've got it on video and multiple other people have got it on video as well. But I identified myself as a journalist at least 7 times, and you can hear it on the video. Not only did I myself identify myself as a reporter, the protesters that were being shoved against the desk and pillars were also shouting and saying, "She's not one of us. She's not a reporter. Please let her go." But the sheriff decided that he was going to pin me against the table and smack his baton into my chest, which resulted in a cracked rib. I continued to report even after that incident. A few reporters came in and pulled me out. 4 reporters were assaulted that night. All 4 of them were working either freelancers or were working for independent media. They were not working for mainstream media. They were not camera persons. They were not working for Chronicle or The Examiner. And they were people that the sheriff's department or others felt that they could go after. I don't know what their intention were, but that is what happened. Briefly after, I went to the hospital and realized that I have to pay around $600 to the hospital, where no examination was done. There were no x-rays. I was told that I have a cracked rib and I could stay for 5 hours if I want an x-ray, or I could just go home, because the only way to treat it is to rest and to be on Vicodin for up to 12 weeks. And the doctors told me that I need to take Vicodin 2 every 4 hours for up to 12 weeks. Anybody who's taken Vicodin knows that you are not functional. I'm a freelancer. If there are 12 weeks for me to recover from a rib injury, if I took the prescribed medicines in the way that I was told, I would have been dysfunctional. I wouldn't have been able to work, and that was 12 weeks of no work. I have a partner who has a full-time job, so luckily maybe I'm one of the few people who can afford to do that. I didn't, that's another thing, but I could have afforded to do that. So those are just one like real life example of how real it is, how real it can get. An injury that I didn't even realize, because I kept reporting for an hour after that, led to, maybe $600 is not much for somebody who's getting a full-time or is a full-time staffer or is able to pay it, but $600 for someone who's being paid per piece is a lot of money. And the second most important thing is that I was lucky enough to have an editor who takes really good care of his team, no matter how small. So he went with me and he basically took me to the investigators, who blamed me for being attacked, who told me that I did not tell the sheriff that I was a reporter, and I did not show the sheriff my press card while I was being pinned down across the desk. But that whole experience taught me a few things that I knew, but they just reaffirmed to me. First, as a freelancer, you need to know journalist associations that will help you. You need to know lawyers associations that will help you. You need to have a strong relationship with your editor, and even if you don't, you need to know that they're responsible for whatever happens to you on the job if you're freelancing for them. I was lucky enough that my editor volunteered and came with me and stood with me during the investigation, but they bullied me for 40 minutes even while my editor was present. They asked me multiple times why a specific bruise was in a specific part of my body when I was being pinned against a desk, and why it was at this angle and not that angle. And these are investigators that are supposed to be independent. This is after my editor was present with me at that time. Third and most important thing about physical security as well as digital security. Oftentimes we're not aware of, and this is from me not as an experience of working in the US, but also having worked in Pakistan. There are different elements that will be, into your contacts. There are different elements of the government or the intelligence agencies that do spy, NSA in the US, for instance. And journalists specifically have to be 10 times as careful about their social networks and about security of their online and offline contacts, because not only if somebody gets access, whether it's an intelligence agency or whether it's an individual or whether it's a hacker, if somebody gets access to my data, they're not only getting access to my data, they're also getting access to my contacts, people who trusted me with their story, and it puts their life at risk. So not only digital security for yourself, but also digital security for your contacts and all of that information. And last but not least, more importantly, there's also been there will always be additional scrutiny as a freelancer when you are submitting stories. So what I always do, and the tip that I'll offer to freelancers, is that you need to make sure that every communication you have with the source, or every communication that you can record, make sure that you record it. I always do video recordings because I can use those videos in my stories as well, but I always make sure that I can do audio recordings, obviously with the consent of the source. But that helps in many ways if the source backs out. If a source backs out when it's a staffer that's reported the story, there's a body of work that the editor can reflect back to and say, this is my reporter, I need to stand up for them. But if you were doing a story and the source backs out, or somebody says, oh, I've been misquoted, which sort of happens because people forget when they say things, especially in protests or when they're angry or in shock, your credibility is on the line. So those are the few things that we need to remember. I'm sorry, it's just a mix of personal anecdotes and a mix of tips, but I hope that was helpful.
Thank you.
Problem in itself when mainstream media or any media outlet decides that they're going to dedicate 1 week to this issue, because that just shows a bit of short-sightedness. It is more like a bluff, I would agree, because this is a problem, it's a crisis, it's a housing crisis that's plaguing not only California, it's plaguing all over the country. So it shouldn't be that 1 week I'm going to do homelessness. It's going to be that every time I'm going to do a story about housing and homelessness, I'm going to try and give it as much honest, broad coverage as I can, and I'm going to make sure that there's a reporter that, especially for large organization, who's doing regular decent stories. And specifically for the Chronicle, who initiated the project, if the Chronicle didn't need to do this project, if they actually did, get Niveus to stop writing about homeless people and stop harping hatred about them. But more importantly, the biggest problem in this project and in this conversation as well, and as a reporter who are essentially witnesses and storytellers, is that the person you're telling the story about needs to be part of the narrative. We need to, the whole conversation was 1 week of coverage about homelessness, and we are going to find the solution. Who are we? I've never missed a meal in my life. I've never been homeless. How am I going to find a solution for homelessness? I can talk to people who will find the solution to homelessness, but where are the voices of the people who are actually homeless on the street? Why not dedicate, if we may, 1 whole week to just talk to them, just talk about their stories. Where did they come from? Why are they here? How do they feel like living on the street? Or just, I've spoken to people and done stories. 48 Hills does regular stories on homelessness, but people who were shoved under the bridge in Division and Bryant during Super Bowl, standing there speaking to them for 45 minutes gave me a terrible headache. I cannot imagine what it's like living there under that bridge with so much noise coming back. Part of me wanted to put out all the recordings up so that people could hear how bad the sound was of the overhead vehicles that kept going and coming. So those are the kind of things that I think, and even whether we are freelancers or just reporters anywhere, we're storytellers, essentially we're witnesses. So we have a responsibility to tell people stories, and the way that we can tell them best is to let people speak as well, rather than painting them with our own biases. Or would love to talk about like Fannie Mae, for instance, or others, or speculators that are benefiting, but we are not able to simply because of lack of resources. We will get sued, or we don't have the necessary insurance to do so. That's why organizations like KPFA or 48 Hills rely on public donations to be able to get enough money not only to pay their workers, but to have that kind of support. So I think that more to what Steve was saying earlier, there needs to be a larger conversation about, like, even as part of the public, that even a $10 donation to, let's say, KPFA, or a $5 donation to 48 Hills per month, like a $15 donation, given to an independent media that you truly believe in, can get a long way to get the stories out there. And it's one thing, and it's important to make that criticism about media and what it does not cover, but that gap that we see and we are all talking about critiquing will not be filled unless there are reporters out there, and who are good reporters, are able to do their job. And the reason why they're not able to do their job is because they need to make a living. And if they're making a living working for one of Murdoch's big sort of like big seven, then he or she will not be able to cover our stories because they will be shut down. If they're working for independent media, then they need to churn in daily stories, because it's a war of how much ads you're getting, how much traffic you're getting, and then that depends on how many funders will give you money apart from the public funding. So I think there needs to be a larger discussion on that as well, and technology now has made it a lot more easier for people to be able to donate money, for people to be shared, worldwide people can make that possible. So as a freelancer working on per article, I would love to not churn out like 40 stories a month and do only 6 stories a year, but do really in-depth investigative report and do only 6 stories, but do them really, really well. But I can't do it. I can't do 6 stories a month when I'm being paid per story. That's one of the biggest problems, and that's what's killing investigative journalism at large. CPJ, Committee to Protect Journalists, is one of the organizations that's really, it's a good contact to have. They do have an office in San Francisco as well. There's Reporters Beyond Borders. There is the PEN America Foundation. There is an organization called Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF. I highly recommend reading their guides and sort of following them. And also, if you look at ijnet.com, they put up a lot of fellowships, and they also put up a lot of details about different courses that are being offered, and they also put up a lot of details about funds that are offered to freelancers in terms of distress. So those are just a few, and I can give you more details about that later. In terms of your earlier question, I think that I would take. It takes a lot to build social movements. I think we're seeing we're in a time and place where we're judging, with all due respect to everyone who's mobilizing right now, we're judging social movements by the number of tweets that we are getting, or Facebook comments, or how many articles are done. Social movements are built over time, and I think that especially the activists who are part of the Black Lives Matter movement understand that fully well, because they have a history to look back at. They have a civil rights history to look back at how those tactics were used and how that momentum was built. So I think that at this, even I would say that this part where these, where we say, oh, this social movement is happening, is also sort of part of lazy journalism, because we see this outburst of protest, and I'm not talking about the US, I'm talking about specifically elsewhere in the world. For instance, a lot of my colleagues in Egypt were part of the revolution, and they were also arrested, and they've been put to jail for up to 10 years, and they're still fighting those court orders. But there is no follow-up reporting on those individuals. There was a lot of reporting on like what was happening in Egypt and how it was amazing, and all that, yada yada yada. And then later on, there are not enough in-depth reporting about what happened to those individuals now. Sure, we heard about the journalists that were detained, and rightly so, and those journalists, Al Jazeera journalists, were sent back home, very fortunately. But there's not enough work that has been done. So I think, like, as a journalist, I would say, maybe an activist can answer that question better, but as a journalist, I think that it's important to recognize that if there are protests, if there's a building of movements, then we need to report it as such, and have a sort of like a historical perspective when approaching these issues, especially of activism, because we see a lot of outbursts of different kind of protests now. So it's easy to say, this has happened, and it's starting off a big social movement, and then it collapses. And we've seen that happening yearly. We saw that with the Occupy. We've seen that in the US several times. So that's I don't know if that was helpful.